Welcome to Living Well with MS, the podcast from Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity, celebrating its 10th year of serving the MS community. I'm your host, Geoff Alex. The goal of our organisation and this podcast is to inform, support and empower people with MS to lead full and happy lives. We're excited you could join us for this new episode. Make sure to check out this episode's show notes for more information and useful links. You can find these on our website at overcomingms.org/podcast or on whichever podcast platform you use to tune into our programme. If you enjoy the show, please spread the word about us on your social media channels or leave a review wherever you tune into our podcast. Have questions or ideas to share? Email us at podcast@overcomingms.org, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter at Geoff Alex. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to Living Well with MS on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And now, let's meet our guest for this episode. Welcome to the latest episode of the Living Well with MS podcast. And this episode is Resilience and MS. And we're having a conversation with Dr. Rachael Hunter. Dr. Hunter is a clinical academic who works as a clinical psychologist in the NHS and as a senior lecturer in clinical and health psychology at Swansea University. She's an OMS herself and wrote the chapter on resilience in the new Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis Handbook. And also, she was on the retreat that I went on, so she was also one of the facilitators of my retreat when I started getting into OMS. So thank you very much for joining us, Rachael Hunter.
Hi Geoff, it's good to see you.
And to start off with, could you just tell us a little bit about your professional background and also your personal journey with MS and OMS?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I now work as a clinical academic. So that means I spend part of my week in a hospital in the NHS here in Wales, working in a physical rehab setting, where I work with patients and with the healthcare teams there. And the other part of my week is spent in university, involving teaching mainly postgraduate students, doing research and other kind of community engagement work as well, including facilitator work with the charity Overcoming MS, which I've been involved with for, like you say, quite a few years now. But on a personal note, I was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS 10 years ago now in 2012. And that was after a really big relapse. But obviously with hindsight, I think everybody says this, with hindsight looking back, I had a number of symptoms over quite a few years, really, including crushing fatigue, really leading up to that big relapse. But the relapse itself involved a lot of sensory and motor symptoms. So I had a lot of numbness, completely down my right side, actually. You could almost draw a line from the top of my head all the way through my body. So numbness, tingling, burning sensations. And that meant my balance was affected and some of my mobility. So I, struggled with a bit of a limp for a little while, and also my speech was affected. So I had a bit of slurred speech at the time. But importantly, I think it's important to say, and I don't think we say it enough, is the conversation about mental health. So for me, my mental health was really affected at the time I was diagnosed, and I really struggled in terms of anxiety and my mood. I really struggled to get my head around what was happening and the diagnosis itself. And in terms of OMS, I was really lucky to find Overcoming MS during my diagnosis, which was quite a protracted period of about 6 months, as it is for a lot of us. And my neurologist told me to give them a ring, really, if I relapsed. And that was about it. So I asked them, well, what can I do to help myself? Is there anything I should be doing? And to give myself the best shot at this. And they didn't really point me to anything in particular. And that, didn't really sit very well with me. So I started to do my own research, like many people do, and that was when I found Professor Roy Swank's work, and that led me ultimately then to the work of Professor Jelinek and the Overcoming MS programme.
So you jumped straight in from diagnosis?
Yeah, so by the time I actually got the signed, sealed, delivered diagnosis letter, I was already making some of the changes for the programme because it just made sense. I'd already read quite a lot about it at this point, and it didn't seem like there was any downside to it. It didn't seem like there was any risks to it, only benefits. It just made sense. And it hadn't really sat very well with me when the neurologist said that there wasn't anything that I could do, because as a psychologist, my whole framework of clinical work is based on the idea that our physical health and our psychological health are intertwined. They absolutely affect each other. So instinctively, I knew that wasn't the case. And I knew that if I was struggling with my mental health, that was going to affect my physical health.
Yeah, I got from unusual people, actually, but it was the first person who really put me onto mental health, apart from following MS, because I similar to you, I had a lengthy diagnosis. I was told almost certainly had MS, but you're not getting any treatment until we're fully, definite. So basically go away and do your own thing for 5 months, but having been told you almost certainly have MS. But physio said to me, because obviously he's doing physical stuff, but actually said, oh, and as well as all that, don't ignore your mental health, because and he was really explaining to me, just saying, if you mustn't forget, because the stress will definitely affect you. So the amount of people I see who are not dealing with the mental side of it, and that will directly affect the physical side of it. And he's saying, I'm not a professional because I'm a physiotherapist, but just look after your mental health and stress as well, as an extra.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I love about working in rehab is that idea of the importance of our mindset and our psychological well-being is completely implicit within rehabilitation psychology or rehabilitation medicine. I really love that approach, and I think it's absolutely. I mean, how could it not be? How could it not be?
Yeah, but I think that's something in the UK, at least, is still not professional. It's not a part of the program. There's still, I don't have any. There's nothing psychological as part of my MS treatment. It's I do have a weekly physio session. They run this neuroactive gym where I am, which is brilliant. And I have a neurologist doing the medical side of it who is pro OMS, which is good. I've got an MS nurse who has eventually become pro OMS. She was very skeptical, I think, originally.
So I would challenge you a little bit on that, Geoff, actually, if I can.
Yeah,
and I would say, actually, there probably is a huge amount of psychological work you're doing in managing your MS.
But that's sort of
the changes you have made in terms of taking control and empowering yourself to make decisions around what you will do or the changes you'll make. They're fundamentally decisions that work at a psychological level and create something within you. So I think you underestimate that.
But I think I've taken that on myself, though. I don't think there's anything that there was nothing in the professional framework.
Yeah,
you don't get assigned a psychologist. You get assigned a physio, but you don't get assigned. So that,
and I don't think everybody needs it. I don't think everybody needs a psychologist. I think we all have within ourselves a lot of capabilities and a lot of resilience, and I guess that kind of that brings us really neatly onto the topic that we're talking about today, which
Well, yeah, it does, because you wrote the resilience chapter of the Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis Handbook. So yeah, what is resilience? Give us a little potted guide on what's resilience.
Well, I mean, before I do that, I wanted to, I just want to caveat this a little bit by saying, I'm not here to talk about resilience because I'm the most resilient person ever, because that is certainly not the case. Like everyone else, I've had times in my life, when things have been really difficult and I've struggled, and my diagnosis being one of them. So I'm not here as a kind of an emblem of what resilience looks like. But I think in my work as a clinical psychologist and as a researcher as well, I've been really lucky enough to spend a lot of time with people who have been through some really difficult and traumatic experiences, and somehow I managed to emerge from them intact, but often stronger and embracing life in a different and more positive way. They seem to have flourished from some of those challenges. And, in my work and in my research, my mind is always, completely blown by that. And I'm just in awe of it, really. So I think I'm talking from that experience as much as my own experience of navigating my diagnosis and life, living with the diagnosis of MS. So I've learned a lot from other people, really, including the MS community and the Overcoming MS community as well. So I'm really here to kind of just share things that I've observed and things that I've learned over that time. So I don't want to be held up as a emblem of resilience.
There is a sort of do as I say, not as I do sometimes.
Try not to do that, but I know what you mean. So, yeah, I mean, what is resilience? Well, you can imagine, like any sort of construct or concept in medicine or science or health, there's loads of different definitions to what resilience is. But I think there's a really nice way of capturing it that I tend to turn to quite often, which is that resilience is sort of an ability to accept one's experiences without avoidance. Depending on what the demands are, of course, that you can continue to try and live your life and pursue your goals despite that adversity or that diversity. So, what does that really mean? Well, it's basically talking about a capacity to respond positively to adverse situations.
And so that could be a bereavement, but equally that would apply to someone who's got a chronic condition.
Yeah.
Whether that's a cancer diagnosis or multiple sclerosis or something like that.
Yeah, so it could be, something that we're having to deal with all of the time. And for lots of us living with chronic conditions, that can feel like a low level constant, or it could be a big event, a loss, like you say, a bereavement or a trauma that can trigger this reaction in us that we need to respond in some way. We need to accept, we need to adapt, and we need to find a way to navigate it. So, there are a range of things that are associated or involved with resilience, and the research has been really good in helping us to identify them. And they're exactly what you'd expect them to be, really, Geoff. Things like optimism, self-esteem, determination, support, social support, really important. But also things like self-care. So being able to take care of ourselves and be compassionate towards ourselves. So I think the more I've got to learn about resilience over the years, the kind of less I think I understand it in a way, because there's so many factors that feed into that. There's so many things that are relevant. And of course, they're kind of individual to you as well. What helps you stay resilient, Geoff, might be different to me.
And there was a question about that some people might find it patronising or insulting when you're talking about the notion of resilience to them. I mean, there is an element, you sort of think sometimes you get experts talking to you who don't have MS, and you do sometimes think. So I always prefer it. If people who've got MS, you kind of you get it, whereas most experts haven't. And some of them still do get it very well, but others are like, yeah, okay, but you don't actually understand exactly what I mean by, it's like spoon theory. Someone was talking about spoon theory the other day. Like, if people haven't come across it, it's like you get so many spoons at the start of the day. Once you've used up your spoons, your energy is completely gone. And I think MSs quite often get those sort of ideas because they're going through it and they're like, okay, I can understand it. But to some professionals, it's like a concept rather than a lived thing. So do you find people find it patronising? You don't talk about resilience, or is that just you learn to deal with it?
I think the reality is sometimes people can find it a bit patronising and a bit insulting sometimes, as if, you just need to be a bit more resilient. You just need to get on with it. Or maybe that you're struggling because you haven't quite got enough resilience. And that's certainly, I think we really need to be careful when we talk about resilience, because that's certainly not the way we would want people to perceive it. But I agree. I think it can be a sensitive topic. So we need to be careful, and we need to qualify what we're saying. I think part of that issue comes because resilience has been a little bit misrepresented sometimes. For example, I know sometimes in healthcare we might provide resilience training to help people cope with what is actually a very challenging, or some might say even broken system. So what we don't want to do is say, actually, we're going to make you more resilient so you can cope with being treated badly. Or cope with this awful environment, because that's not what we want to do. We don't want to excuse the political or the socio-economic challenges that people are facing. So I think that's why we have to be really, really careful. But on the other hand, I think, like I said at the start, I've worked with incredible people in my career, in the MS community and in a range of other clinical areas. And I just think there's so many important things that we can take from people's experiences of, surviving and overcoming challenges that are really, really useful. And we can use them to really help us shape services and to really find ways that we can support people in a more helpful way.
And so how would resilience, the relationship of resilience and having this traumatic diagnosis of something like MS. So how would you deal with that? You've just been... I think some of us... For me, it was actually not a terrible thing, because there was something clearly very wrong with me, and not having a brain tumour was quite good. It was like, you start going through your head what it could be, and you're like, actually... Because my father had MS, so I was like, okay, I know that it's not necessarily like as bad as you might have thought. But some people, they had no experience, and then it is massively traumatic because they thought they had an eye problem that would be fixed by an optician, and suddenly they've got a life-changing diagnosis. So I think it does depend on background, but it's certainly, there is trauma there, isn't there? So what's the relationship of resilience and a traumatic event like that?
Yeah, it's a good point, Geoff. And, being diagnosed with something like MS is huge. It's often described as a life-changing diagnosis. And it really, it is. It really is in so many ways. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people will be traumatized. They almost, they'll probably see this as a huge challenge, and maybe see that they have to keep dealing with this for the rest of their life. But it's important to say that for most people, even facing really difficult traumas or challenges, the vast majority of people cope with them really well. Actually, we've come to talk about trauma so easily, haven't we, in society? We talk about feeling depressed when actually we might feel sad. We talk about feeling traumatized when we're kind of, a bit shocked or something. So we've colloquialized this language, I think, which is also a bit unhelpful. And so we can get quite far away from the idea that actually we can forget, actually the vast majority of us are really able to manage quite challenging things in our life. We can cope with things. And what's interesting, actually, I was reading a paper the other day, and it was saying that actually the fear of being traumatized, the fear of PTSD has become far greater than the disorder itself, far greater than post-traumatic stress disorder itself. So, if we look at PTSD data, only about 10% of those who experience a significant trauma will go on to experience significant PTSD symptoms, while the fear of being traumatized is going to be much greater than that. And also within those people who have significant PTSD symptoms, 90% of those people will go on to have complete remission of those symptoms. Those symptoms, they'll overcome them. that they'll be okay. So, we're looking at very small numbers, but a large part of our narrative is around trauma, isn't it? And about how things are traumatic. And that can be helpful, because it's good to have, it's so good that we're talking much more about mental health and its impact on us. But also we need to also recognize actually that we're quite resilient as humans. We do have the capacity to overcome huge challenges in our lives.
So you should be optimistic, really, because you're talking about actually the chances are low, and of that, chances of full recovery are very high. So it's a 10% of a 10% is the...
Yeah, I mean, and like you said, I've spoken to lots of people, I'm sure you have too, Geoff, in the MS community, who, like you, were quite relieved when they got their diagnosis in the end, because your mind goes to all these places actually that are far worse outcomes. And so sometimes it's a relief initially for some people, and B, now I know what I'm dealing with, I can get on with it. I can find treatments and I can respond. I can make changes to my lifestyle. So, yeah, I think it's really important that we don't assume that this is going to be traumatic, and we don't catastrophize around that, because that can really then shape the way we behave and the way we think, and that can be quite unhelpful.
So, what are the building blocks of resilience then? So we talked about resilience. So how would you go about saying to someone how you follow building blocks of resilience?
I think when I started to really become really interested in resilience, one of the things I did was look at a lot of what the different psychological theories were around resilience, but also the theories relating to positive psychology, those kind of models. And what you see is a lot of overlap between a lot of these models. And one thing that is really clear is that actually all of these things are lovely. You can have all these great ideas and great models, but I was left thinking, well, that's all really nice and good, but if you haven't got the basics, that basic foundation, then you can't really attend to the higher level stuff. So, for example, how can you, really develop and think about your spirituality, for example, or your relationships, if you don't know where your next meal's coming from, or you're exhausted because you haven't slept properly. And at a physiological level, if you're putting bad food in your body or you're not hydrated. So it kind of really struck me that actually we don't say enough to people, or we don't talk enough about how important those fundamental building blocks are. If you think of it like a triangle, we need the building blocks to be stable at the bottom of the triangle. And those kind of basic functional day-to-day things that we need to do to keep ourselves alive and functioning at our best are actually quite simple. Sleep, their hydration, eating good food, and being safe. Safety is a really important thing. And, it's a challenging time at the moment. A lot of people are struggling to even meet those basic needs. And I think we have to really acknowledge that.
Yeah, it's the thing. I don't know if it's the same as what you're talking about. I remember the hierarchy of needs, where you've got to meet the lower one, and then you get to a point as well with saying, well, you need a certain amount of food to survive, and that's one of the very lower level ones. But then you get to a point, there's no point in adding more food to that. You won't get more out of it. And the same with, there's no point if you've got a house, you've got food, you've got all your basics taken care of, you don't actually get happier. It gets to the point where actually having more income doesn't make you happier, because you met the basics, and then you get up to this, I think, self-actualization at the top or something. It's like,
yeah, that's right.
I can't remember who did it. Began with an M.
Maslow.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it just makes sense, doesn't it? At a very, concrete level, it makes a lot of sense that we can't attend to the higher grade stuff if our basic needs aren't being met. But I think it's a conversation that doesn't happen enough when we talk about resilience and when we talk about well-being.
So something I've come across was that you have a 3Ps framework. So what is the 3Ps, and could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's something that I developed myself after spending quite a lot of time looking at the various models and the theories that related to things like resilience, positive psychology, and also post-traumatic growth, which is something that we see actually much more frequently coming out of trauma than PTSD, which is interesting. So as I was looking at these things, it definitely struck me that there were so many variables and factors across all these theories and literature, and it was quite confusing. And in, when I'm teaching and when I'm working with people, it's really important to try and make things as simple as we can, not just because we want to dumb it down, but because it's just, if we don't know how to, if it's not clear, then we're just not going to use it. It's not going to be practical. It's not going to be useful. And so I really sort of developed it for my own, way of using things, really. And I noticed that some of the things that were being repeated related to certain factors. So, that sits neatly under pleasure. These are things that relate to pleasure. These are factors that relate to having meaning or purpose in my life. And these are factors that actually I need to repeat. These are factors in my life I need to just keep practicing and keep doing over and over. Because as you know, Geoff, like, it isn't like you just make these changes and then the work is done, or you have a little time of reflection and then you're resilient. It's a process. It's a constant day-to-day thing. It's not a glamorous thing. It's work, isn't it? It's a practice.
Well, I think it's the seventh step of the 7-step program, isn't it? That it isn't really a step. It's just saying that you need to keep doing it forever. It's a permanent change.
Yeah, and so that's really where the idea of the 3 Ps came from. And each one of them, under each one of them, you can congregate or group a lot of information. We can gather evidence under each one of those things. But the nice thing about it is that they also can overlap and they can interact. So the things that give you pleasure are often the things that connect to your sense of purpose as well. And we know that if we practice things regularly, then they're going to be more likely to be useful to us in the long term.
So it's, you've got pleasure, purpose, and practice. So going into those then a little bit more, how can you get more pleasure in your life?
So, pleasure is a really interesting one. I think it's, it can be easy to dismiss the idea of having more pleasure in your life, but actually pleasure can encompass so many things. Like I said, it could be doing something that connects you to your passion. It could be something that connects you to other people. So straight away, we're bringing in the sense of community and sense of connection. But doing things that we enjoy, that's something that, when we have a busy life, it's often the first thing that we get rid of. We put our responsibilities first, and often the things that we take pleasure in and that we get pleasure from and contentment from are the things that we're first to remove from our life. But so actually integrating them is quite a bold act of self-compassion, really. It's a way to take care of ourselves, nurture our contentment, and it allows us to then also practice gratitude, which we know from the research is something that's really protective for our well-being.
So we should almost treat it like exercise in sort of way. Like when you exercise, you think I'm not doing something selfish. I'm doing something I need to do, and it's similar to that. It's not a selfish act to do something for your own pleasure.
Exactly, and I think the other thing to say is a lot of people find it really hard to integrate pleasure into their lives, particularly if you feel, and let's be honest, some people feel that they're not worthy of that. They feel unworthy of having time to themselves. They think that they shouldn't be allowed to take care of themselves or look after themselves. So I think we need to recognize that actually it's important. Like you say, it's an important part, and I think that's why I really wanted to include pleasure in the framework, because like you say, we forget about it. We push it away because something like exercise, we can see the value of, like, yes, I'll put that in because that's good for me. And I wanted to highlight, that actually taking time to do things you enjoy and that bring you pleasure, that's actually really good for you. At a physiological level, we get the oxytocin release, we get the, a neurochemical release that's really protective and good for us when we do the things we enjoy. So it's not just at a psychological level, it's very much at a physiological level as well.
And so moving on to purpose. So how can people find their true purpose? Because I think that applies to a lot of people as well. I think they sort of go through life just being, not really doing, they don't have a target. They basically sort of day to day, they go to a job, they come home, they eat some food, they sit in front of the TV, and then they repeat endlessly without thinking that they actually have a purpose. I think a majority of people would say they don't have a purpose in life. And so how would someone go about connecting or finding their purpose?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think life is busy, and the way that we've been conditioned to live, in a way, really, is to, like you say, be busy, go to work, come home, give to others, our family, prioritize others' needs sometimes. And we can get so caught up in that. We can become very disconnected from what we really want or what our real values are. And so I think, there are ways that you can reconnect to your purpose and meaning. And I think being diagnosed with MS is often, or any, condition or illness, it often catapults us into that, doesn't it? It often is this massive kick up the bum, a lot of us say, it was a wake-up call. It really made me reevaluate what I was doing, which actually can feel like a real gift. It's probably the one gift that you get when you get a diagnosis like MS, is just the opportunity to go, hang on a minute, where is my life going? What am I doing? Is this where I want to be? So we've already been given that opportunity to reflect, and if we take it, it can be a real opportunity to make changes if we want to. So I think, thinking about what our purpose and meaning is doesn't have to be hugely complex. I think if we give people the time and space to think about it, people are very, very quick to know what's important to them in their life. That's often around their family, their friends. It could be around spirituality, religion. It could be about living a life that they feel has had purpose or value to someone else. So it could be serving other people. So sometimes what we do is we'll take time with people to pause and get them to write down what their intrinsic, kind of their core values in their life are. And we might ask them to then rank them in order of what's important to them. And then to take a moment to look at each one of those and write a sentence, really, a kind of intention sentence, we might call it, or an intention statement about how they intend to make a change in their life, to kind of align their life to be more in keeping with that value. So that's a really nice exercise people can do to, if they want to pause and take a moment to think about what drives them, really. What are the things that light them up and that really connect to them? I think that's how you can really connect to your purpose.
And then the final one, practice. So what do you mean by practice?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that made me include the word practice was I really love the way we talk about a meditation practice, the way that actually what we're talking about is a routine. It is kind of a habit, isn't it? But I love the way that school of thought calls it a practice, because it creates that idea that we never really get perfect at anything. We're all just keeping going with it. We're all just trying.
But practice is a funny word, because it can mean different things, can't it? Because it can mean sort of doing something regularly, or it can mean a learning process, or it can be a doctor's surgery. And we sort of have So you're sort of saying that is both practices, both to sort of do something regularly, but also that you're constantly learning. Is that what you mean by it?
Yeah, so it's that kind of dual meaning, really, of keeping that repetitive action, keeping going, because when you make changes in your life, or when you face significant events in your life, it is important to just keep going, and actually that change doesn't come from big grand gestures. Change comes from small things done repeatedly over time, really. So the idea of practice really came through that.
So I mean, I sort of touched upon it that I don't, certainly in my MS team, there's no one providing any form of clinical psychological help. So, and I think if people are treated in that way, it's probably because it's got to a point where things have got quite bad, and we want to obviously not get to that point. So if you were trying to look more at self-care, what would you say is a self-care approach that you can take?
Yeah, so again, self-care is integral to what we need to be practicing all the time. And I think making it a part of any framework is really important. But I suppose I have quite a broad definition of self-care, and that's going to be very individual for each person. But I always encourage people to really think broadly about what self-care could be. There's the classic ideas of candles round the bubble bath, but that's who's going to do that every week. That might be nice, but actually self-care can take so many shapes and forms that are really, really essential. So it could be something as basic, related to those basic needs, really, as making sure that you have a nap. And interestingly, that was a part of Swank's original program, wasn't it? It was making sure people took time to have an afternoon nap. So it could be something as simple as a nap, but it could also be something, like integrating the pleasure time. So scheduling activities that bring you pleasure and joy, that connect you to people that you feel supported by or that you enjoy spending time with. But I think there's another area that's, often dismissed or forgotten about, and that's really important in self-care, and that's around self-compassion. So in particular, being kind to yourself and letting go, perhaps, of some of the things that we beat ourselves up with constantly. And, there are things in all of our lives that can be a bit maybe upsetting. They could be challenging. We might be in relationships or jobs that we find really difficult, quite toxic even. And staying in that environment is a constant challenge to us. It's a constant pressure and a source of stress that we really don't need. So sometimes self-care is the act of letting go. Sometimes it's about knowing, okay, I'm going to walk away from that relationship, not because I want to punish that person, but because I need to take care of myself. And similarly with forgiveness, we're holding on to pain and resentment. That can also be something that's causing a chronic stress for us as well. So letting go of those things, or forgiving ourselves for staying in positions that we might have stayed in, they can also be seen as acts of self-care. So again, it can be such a broad range of what we can do to take care of ourselves. But I think, practicing, again, coming back to that idea of practicing self-compassion for ourselves is really, really important. And, we can sit that under self-care if you want, but I think it's really important for well-being and definitely for helping us stay resilient.
Okay, and with that, thank you very much for joining us, Rachael Hunter. Thank you for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find all sorts of useful links and bonus information there. Do you have questions about this episode or ideas about future ones? Email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. We'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Living Well with MS is kindly supported by a grant from the Happy Charitable Trust. If you'd like to support the Overcoming MS charity and help keep our podcast advertising free, you can donate online at overcomingms.org/donate. To learn more about Overcoming MS and its array of free content and programs, including webinars, recipes, exercise guides, OMS circles, our global network of community support groups, and more, please visit our website at overcomingms.org. While you're there, don't forget to register for our monthly e-newsletter so you can stay informed about the podcast and other news and updates from Overcoming MS. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time. The Living Well with MS family of podcasts is for private, non-commercial use and exists to educate and inspire our community of listeners. We do not offer medical advice. For medical advice, please contact your doctor or other licensed healthcare professional. Our guests are carefully selected, but all opinions they express are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Overcoming MS charity, its affiliates, or staff.